All right, as we get started today, we're going to take a look at the homework that you did from our last lesson. Per the comments, I had corrected, the description rather of the YouTube video, I corrected the homework assignment. Should have been pages 182 to 183, numbers 7 and 12. I believe they gave section 3.34, so hopefully you did the correct section. Well, let's take a look at those two constructions that you were supposed to have done last night. Number 7, first of all, was to construct a rhombus. Construct a rhombus, and you're going to be given one angle and one diagonal. Given an angle and a diagonal. You can give yourself either angle, either acute or obtuse. Of course, we know that in a rhombus, all the sides are equal. We know that these two angles are equal in acute. These two angles would be equal and obtuse. These would be supplementary to each other. We also know that the diagonals, regardless of which one we give ourselves, have to bisect each other and will be perpendicular to each other. And the key to this construction will bisect the angles of the rhombus. Now, I'm not sure which ones you gave yourself. There's a lot of ways we could do this. I'm actually going to give myself an obtuse angle just to mix things up a little bit here. We usually do acute angles, but I'm going to say, well, let's say we've got the obtuse angle right here given. And the easiest way to do this would be to give yourself the diagonal that matches. So in this case, go with the shorter diagonal. Now, you didn't have to, but it's the easiest way to do it, and you're given the choice, right? So that would certainly be the way to go. So we're going to go with the short diagonal. We'll say D sub S, diagonal short, and this here, of course, is just my given angle. Now, if I choose to do it this way, again, ordinarily we go with the acute angle and the long diagonal. The construction is the same, except we're going to start on the opposite end. So I wanted to show it this way just so we could mix up the perspective a little bit. Start, of course, with the big long line, but starting at the right end instead of the left end for a change. My first thought would be, hey, let's measure the diagonal, but where do I put it, right? Well, we know the diagonal is going to be the bisector of this angle. So start with the angle first, and then we can bisect, and that gives us our spot for the diagonal. So I would start by making this arc. Of course, we have to turn the compass the opposite direction as we make the arc this way. We can throw the ruler on the floor and measure across. And measure across. And as we connect the dots, that gives us this first angle. And at this point, we said we wanted to bisect the angle. Now, I already have an arc right here, so I can just open the compass a little bit further, make an arc out here, come to this point, make an arc. If you wanted to, you'd make a new arc and then open the compass wide and do that. But I know that along this line that I'm drawing is where that diagonal will fall, since I chose to make this the short diagonal that goes to my obtuse angle. Well, I obviously know the base point here. To find this point up here, we just measure the diagonal with the compass and mark it off. And once I've done that, I now know both of these key points. Now, there are a few ways in which you could finish. One is, you know that this angle has to equal this angle, which also equals this angle and this angle. So one method would be to make an arc, make arcs, measure across, and when you connect the dots, you'll have your rhombus. That would be a perfectly fine way to do it. But I like this approach. I know that these 2 points will lie in the perpendicular bisector of this diagonal, right? Because the diagonals are perpendicular bisectors. So what I think the easiest way to do this would be is to simply construct the perpendicular bisector of the diagonal that I just marked off. And when I do, my straight edge is just barely long enough. These 2 points must be the other vertices of the rhombus. And all I have to do now, connect them straight down, and I'll have my rhombus constructed there. Right, so there's our rhombus. That's probably the best way to do number 7 there at the bottom of page 182. So we move to page 183. You are now constructing a trapezoid. Not just any trapezoid, though, an isosceles trapezoid. And you were given both bases and the altitude. So important to remember, the bases, of course, are going to be parallel, but because it's isosceles, whatever angle's formed here has to be formed here. Now that's interesting because that means that this will be perfectly centered over top of the lower base. So base 1, base 2, for instance, base 2 has to be perfectly centered. What that means is that the center of B2 has to be over the center of B1. And this altitude could be anywhere inside here. But why not put it right at the centers, the midpoints? Why not allow the altitude to be the perpendicular bisector of both bases? So that's how we're going to put together this construction here, is to start by drawing a top base, a lower base, and an altitude. I'm going to make the altitude the shortest of them. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way per se, but I will do it that way. I believe that's what we see somewhat represented in the picture here. All right, so for starters, I would start with a big long line. And, I don't know, maybe start at this right end point again, going back to what we normally would do. Take the compass and go and get this other end point of base 1. Well, I bet I'm numbered backwards here. Base 2 is called the shorter one on the sketch. Base 1, the longer one on the sketch. So let's do it that way. Base 1. And starting at this first end point, mark it off. And we now have these 2 points for our picture. The next thing I'd like to do is get the x. Get that midpoint by constructing that perpendicular bisector. And once we've got the perpendicular bisector drawn on here, there's also giving us our line for our altitude. That gives us this x that we drawn earlier. From here, measure up the altitude length to get your other x. And so here is the top of my trapezoid. Well, obviously we know that the top base needs to run, first of all, parallel to the lower base. So since we already have one perpendicular, making another perpendicular to that perpendicular, of course, would give us our parallel. So make marks on either side, open the compass wider, mark out here in space, mark out here in space. And when we connect the dots, we get a line upon which the altitude, the top base will fall. It'll fall along here, right? But where? Well, realize this point is the midpoint of this base, so we just need halves. So if we come over here to our given line, and we were to construct the perpendicular bisector of base 2, that would give us the opportunity to copy half of base 2 off on either side. We just need to get those halves. And so here is half of base 2 from here to here. Let's measure that off. And put half of it here and half of it here. That gives us these 2 points. 1, 2. And when we connect the dots down, we've got, maybe re-highlight this line and make it a little bit brighter on the screen, our isosceles trapezoid. Given those 2 bases, base 2 the top base, base 1 the bottom base, and our altitude there in the middle. And that's what we'd be looking at for our construction. Hopefully this was helpful to you at this time. If you would go and clear your desk, except for a clean sheet of paper, a pencil, a compass, and a straight edge. Clean sheet of paper, pencil, compass, and straight edge. You're going to have about the next 15 to 20 minutes or so to work on quiz 31A. 3 constructions that we've already done together at one point over the last week or so of class. The extra paper is important because if you were to start the construction on the construction quiz, which is what we'll do, right? You'll do the quiz right on my quiz copy. But if you start it and realize, oh no, this ain't it, I want you to be able to have other paper right there handy where you say, forget this one. I'm going to do it on paper now. I'll just copy the lengths over as I need them. Okay, so it's important to have that extra paper out so you have a second chance, or maybe even a third chance on some of these constructions if it were to require it. So pencil, compass, straight edge, and an extra sheet of paper as well. At this time, if the proctor would pause the video and actually end this video, we're going to have a new video segment once you're finished to finish out the end of this lesson. But go ahead and give quiz 31A at the top of the paper, first and last name, along with today's date.